"Don't open that cage," they warned, but the giant Apache woman kissed the mountain man inside. Folks say it happened high in the Thunder Ridge, where clouds touch the stone and secrets fester like old wounds. They begged her not to do it. Preacher, sheriff, even her own kin. Every soul in the valley cried out, warned her, swore the man behind those iron bars was cursed, a killer, a madman, a beast. And still, that towering Apache woman with hands like shovels and eyes like river glass leaned in close and kissed him. Why would anyone kiss the devil himself? And what kind of woman risks everything for a man the world locked away and forgot? Some say it was love, others say it was vengeance. But those who were there, those who watched the mountain bleed that day, they whisper a different tale, one of ruin, redemption, and a truth too strange for Sunday sermons. When iron bars bend and the truth walks free, one question lingers in the dust. Who saw the soul inside, and who only saw the cage? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this one still bring us together across miles, memories, and beliefs. If you still believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the power of doing what's right, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which estate you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep these stories alive. The fire hadn't stopped burning when they gave her the verdict. Smoke curled in the sky like the spirits themselves were watching, and the circle of elders stood stone-faced beneath the red sun. Blood still stained the earth. His blood, the elder who'd struck the child. Nalinah had thrown him hard enough to crack his skull against the medicine drum. They said he was chosen, said his hand was law. But Nalinah saw only fear in the girl's eyes, the small, pale orphan who'd wandered into their care 2 winters ago. No one else had moved to stop him, no one but her. They didn't say her name when they banished her. They called her the woman, not Apache, not daughter, just woman. She stood tall as they burned her tent, her braids still damp with river water, and waited for them to finish. She didn't plead. She didn't look back. When the flames took the last of her mother's cooking bowl, she turned and walked. The child whimpered but clung tight. Her fever was climbing again. Nalinah tied her to her back with a deer hide wrap, wrapped both their shoulders in a buffalo blanket, and began the long walk west, out of sacred land, out of memory, into the in-between. The borderlands were dry and angry. Frozen dust kicked up with each step, biting her cheeks and lips. The wind carried no kindness. Townsfolk stared as she passed, an enormous woman with fire in her gait and a sick white child on her back. Some pointed, others spat. One woman tossed a potato at her boots and muttered, "Savage whore." Nalinah didn't flinch, didn't pause. Her eyes were on the black line of mountains ahead. At the edge of Dryvale, the preacher stepped down from his chapel steps, tall hat against the wind, beard white as the snow just beginning to fall. He took one look at her, and the sleeping child bound to her back and sighed. "You ain't gonna find peace in those ridges," he said, his voice low, like he feared being overheard. "That mountain don't forgive. It hides things. Things like him." She stopped for the first time in 2 days. "Who?" "Don't matter. Just keep walking. Don't go where the trees twist like no tree ought to, and don't look for the cage in the stone." Nalinah didn't reply. The child coughed again, wet and rattling. The preacher stepped back like she carried plague. That night frost bit through the seams of her moccasins. Coyotes howled in the hills. The child's fever raged so high she muttered in sleep, calling out for a mother she barely remembered. Nalinah prayed, not with words but with her body, wrapping the girl close, whispering lullabies in a tongue that felt broken without her people beside her. On the third day, the clouds broke open with snow. Her breath came in gasps now. Trees thickened, and the path narrowed to nothing but hoof prints and broken shale. It was then, as the light died, that she saw it. A rusted cage fused into the mountain itself. Blackened iron, frozen chains. Inside, unmoving, sat a man with a beard like a bear and eyes that did not blink. Nalinah took one step forward. The child stirred. The man did not move. And then his voice scraped the air. "Best not come closer, girl. You don't want what's inside here." But Nalinah looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I need water. The child's burning up." The man grunted. "Springs behind you, 10 paces west. Boil it twice." She nodded once. No thanks, no fear, just survival. The cage creaked as the wind howled through it, and behind her, the mountain closed its mouth. The last light of day fell in slanted beams through the twisted pine trees, bathing the rocks in a blood-orange glow. Nalinah moved cautiously through the thickening snow, each step crunching beneath her worn soles. The child on her back moaned again, barely conscious now. Her skin was hot as coals, her breath shallow and fast. Nalinah had begun whispering songs from her girlhood without realizing it, half for the child, half to steady her own rising panic. Then she saw it, welded into the side of a granite outcrop, half swallowed by roots and rust, sat the cage. Not just bars, but a cage made of iron, thick as wagon axles, bolted into the mountain's ribs. No door, no keyhole, only a single narrow hatch with a padlock the size of a man's fist. Inside, hunched in shadow, sat a figure too still to be sleeping. His arms were thick with corded muscle, draped in rags stiff with weather and blood. Shackles bit into his wrists, connected to the bars by long lengths of chain that clinked when the wind shifted. His hair, long and silver gray, tangled like the moss above. And those eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, watched her like the mountain itself had come alive. Nalinah froze. Her hand instinctively went to the stone knife at her side, though she knew it wouldn't do much against a man like that. Not if he wanted out. But he didn't rise, didn't speak. Only when the child let out a hoarse cry did he move. "Springs behind you," he said, voice like gravel sliding in a tin can. 10 paces. You'll smell the moss. Boil the water twice. The calmness of it unsettled her more than rage would have. She stared at him. "You been watching me?" "I ain't blind," he muttered, shifting slightly to rest his back against the iron. "And that child's got the look of death in her eyes. Don't matter what color her skin is. Fever don't discriminate." Nalinah hesitated. You're him, aren't you? Clive Tamerlane." He chuckled once, bitter and hollow. "Haven't heard that name out loud in near 10 years. Most folks just call me Ridge Reaper now. Makes it easier to hate me. What are you doing in there?" Clive's gaze met hers, hard and unwavering. "Serving time, the only kind that counts." She swallowed and looked to the child, then back at the iron that held him. "You don't want out?" "If I wanted out, I'd be gone. The cage don't hold me. My word does." Nalinah shook her head, disbelieving. "You could freeze." "I've frozen before." The sky was dimming fast. The wind carried the scent of coming snow. She looked again at the rocks, how they curved like a natural wall around the cage, shielding it from one side. It was the only shelter she'd seen for miles. The child whimpered again. Nalinah didn't ask permission. She turned and began gathering pine boughs, stone, and dry kindling. She built a lean-to against the curve of rock just out of arm's reach from the cage. Clive didn't speak again. He watched her, silent and still. She boiled water from the spring, then cooled it with snow and slowly spooned it into the child's cracked lips. She laid out a deer hide beneath the shelter and wrapped the girl in every scrap of warmth she had. Only once in the middle of the night did Clive speak again. "You should leave, girl. That child don't belong near a man like me." Nalinah didn't even look up. "Neither do I," she said. "But here we are." Snow began to fall in soft, whispering sheets, bearing the tracks that led back to Dryvale. By morning, there would be no way to follow them. She had made her choice. She was staying. The storm came down like judgment. Snow piled heavy on the world, thick enough to bury a man's tracks in moments and silence the forest in white stillness. Days passed where the sun never fully showed its face, just a pale glow behind gray clouds. Trees groaned under the weight of ice. Firewood burned faster than it dried. Nalinah's hands cracked from the cold, but she moved like stone through each day, quiet and determined. Every morning she boiled water, checked the traps, built up the fire near the cage, and every night she lay the child between furs and pressed close to keep her warm. Clive rarely spoke, but he watched, always watched. His beard caught frost, his lips chapped, but he never once asked for more than he was given. Sometimes he murmured a direction as she walked past. South side's got rabbit prints, or white pine bark will cure that cough. She listened. She didn't thank him. There were no pleasantries between them. Only a strange understanding, forged in snow and silence. She learned to spot the tiny drag of a fox's tail in the snow. Learned that a rabbit wouldn't cross open ground unless it was desperate. Clive showed her how to strip pine needles for tea, how to mash juniper into a bitter salve, how to tie a loop snare that wouldn't break a creature's leg. She brought him pieces of meat, half burnt sometimes, but he ate without complaint. The child stirred more each day. Her eyes lost their glaze. One afternoon, she gripped Nalinah's finger with strength, and that night, for the first time in weeks, Nalinah wept, quietly, with her back turned to the cage, the wind hiding her tears. Down in Dryvale, the whispers had begun. Old women shook their heads in front of the general store. Men spit tobacco and muttered words like witch and heathen. Sheriff Orland Pike sharpened his knife on the porch rail, eyes cold. He didn't like ghosts coming back from the dead, and he especially didn't like stories of a savage woman shacking up with one. "Reckon she's feeding him more than stew," one man jeered. "Maybe she's got him charmed." "Or maybe," another said, "she's as twisted as he is." But no one dared go up the ridge, not yet. One night the wolves came. 3 of them, lean and desperate, padded into the edge of camp just as the fire began to die. Nalinah froze, knife in hand, heart pounding. The child lay wrapped in furs. Clive's voice cut through the dark like a rifle crack. "Left flank, the tall one. He'll lunge first." She didn't question. She moved. The wolf leapt. Her blade met it midair, slicing the beast's chest. It tumbled and rolled, yelping into the night. The others scattered into the trees. Breathing hard, blood on her hands, Nalinah turned toward the cage. Clive hadn't moved. "You could have let them tear us apart," she said. "You had it handled," he replied. She stared at him. "You didn't even stand." "Didn't need to." The snow fell again, soft as ash. She rebuilt the fire. He watched her hands as they trembled, not from fear, but from the cold truth she couldn't shake. If he could fight, if he could teach, if he could warn, then why did he stay in that cage? He never asked her to open it, never begged, never even leaned toward the door. It was as if the iron was part of him, a self-made tomb. And still, he helped. Still, he stayed. Every day she looked at that lock a little longer. Every night she wondered, was he protecting her from the world or from himself? And why did she believe him more than the stories whispered down in Dryvale? The days grew longer, but the cold didn't ease. Winter lingered with teeth, gnawing at bone and will. Nalinah moved through it like a figure carved from wood, sturdy, silent, unbending. She hunted now with purpose, not desperation. The child, whose name was Elsie, had color in her cheeks again. Her cough, once dry and rattling, now came soft and rare. Her eyes began to follow the snowflakes as they danced above the shelter, and sometimes she laughed in her sleep. Clive remained a shadow behind iron. He spoke when needed, taught without warmth, accepted food with a nod. The snow drifted against his cage, climbing high around the base, but he made no complaint. His skin grew pale. His frame, once broad as a wagon yoke, thinned beneath the layers of cloth and frost. Nalinah offered to build a fire closer. He declined. When she pressed, he simply said, "I earned the cold." That was the kind of man he was. Gruff, measured, always just short of kindness. His words held the weight of someone who'd seen too much, but he never shared what it was. He never told her why the world wanted him forgotten. One afternoon, Nalinah followed rabbit tracks into a thicket near the camp's edge. The trail ended at a weathered pine hunched against the sky. There, along the trunk, she saw the carvings, rough, uneven letters, gouged deep, a row of names. Most were men's names, with birth years beside them. All dead now, surely. Some had full dates next to them. Others were just marked with a cross. But at the bottom, alone and set apart, was one that stopped her heart. E.T., no date. Just those two letters inside a lopsided heart. A child's initials. She ran her fingers over the bark. The knife marks were old, smoothed by years, but still deep, still full of something raw. That evening, she waited until Clive had finished his ration, just a crust of cornbread and boiled roots, and then sat near the cage staring into the fire. "You wrote on the pine," she said. He didn't answer. The names and the child. A silence settled between them, thick as smoke. Then he exhaled slowly. Didn't think anyone would find that. Who was she? He looked past her, past the fire, past the snow and the stars above. "My daughter, Elizabeth." Nalinah didn't speak, didn't move. "She died," Clive said, voice flat, "because I tried to stop men who didn't want to be stopped, because I thought being loud would make me right. I was wrong. And she paid for it." Nalinah's hands tightened in her lap. "And the cage." He looked at her then, eyes rimmed red but hard as steel. "I swore I'd stay locked in this box until someone looked at me, not with hate, not with fear, but with something real, with forgiveness, until they opened it of their own will. Not because I begged, not because I tricked them, just because they believed I was worth freeing." She stared at him. "That's foolish." "No," he said. "That's justice. You think sitting in a cage makes you good again?" "No," he whispered. "I think it keeps the bad from spreading." She turned away, throat thick. His words didn't sound proud. They sounded like the last breath of a man buried alive by memory. The fire popped between them. Snow drifted down in slow, silent curtains. And from her bedroll, the child murmured in her sleep, "Mama?" Not knowing that the man in the cage had once lost a child too. Not knowing that two lives now circled the same wound. Nalinah lay awake all night, staring at the key tied around her neck. And for the first time since she found him, she wasn't sure what scared her more, that Clive might be lying, or that he wasn't. The wind shifted that morning, carrying with it something softer than cold. Hope. The girl no longer burned with fever. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, and her breathing, once shallow and rattling, had grown deep and steady. She opened her eyes at dawn, blinked slowly, and looked into Nalinah's face with clarity. Nalinah didn't speak. Her breath caught in her chest, and she simply pulled the girl into her arms. There were no tears. Her tribe had taught her to weep in silence, but her shoulders shook with quiet relief. She built the fire higher than usual, not out of necessity, but celebration. She crushed pine needles and boiled them in water, making a sweet-smelling tea that eased the child's throat. For the first time, Elsie ate more than a few bites, rabbit stew with a touch of wild onion, and even giggled when Nalinah made a face of exaggerated delight. The camp, carved from snow and silence, seemed warmer somehow. The mountain listened, and for once did not roar. That evening, as dusk settled like ash, Nalinah sang. The song was old, older than her own memories. A lullaby passed from her grandmother's lips to her mother's, and now from hers to the child. She didn't sing it loudly, just a low hum that moved through the trees like smoke from the fire. Words in the Apache tongue braided together in verses about river, stones, and deer tracks, and how the stars would always find their way home. Clive said nothing, but when she glanced over, he was staring into the flames, jaw tight, the lines in his face etched deeper than usual. When she reached the final verse, his shoulders rose, then fell, and he turned his face away from the firelight. She let the last note fade into silence. "Did you have children?" Clive didn't look at her. No, it was a lie. She felt it in her bones, but she let it pass. 3 days later, a trapper came up from the South Trail. His boots snapped ice-crusted twigs, and his fur coat was crusted with blood. Rabbit or man, it was hard to tell. He was looking for elk. He found something else. He stopped short when he saw Clive through the bars, eyes going wide as rifle barrels. "Sweet mother of mercy," he gasped. "You're—" Clive didn't move. Nalinah stood slowly, blocking the child from view. The trapper stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. "You're supposed to be dead. They said you fell off Devil's Pass, broke your neck. They said—" "Then maybe you ought to keep believing that," Clive said quietly. The trapper didn't answer. He turned and fled, crashing through the brush like a hunted animal. The next morning there were no birdsong, just silence, broken only by the hiss of wind dragging frost across rock. 2 days later, they came. 6 men on horseback, led by Sheriff Orland Pike, rode up the mountain like death in gray wool. Pike wore a long coat and a pistol slung low, the way killers wear them. His mustache was curled sharp, and his eyes, black as river mud, took in the camp with disgust. He dismounted without a word, walked past the child, past the shelter, straight to the cage. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "You are alive." Clive didn't respond. "You got any idea the bounty's still on your head? Ridge Reaper?" Still no reply. Pike turned to Nalinah. "And you must be real proud of yourself, tending to a murderer like he's your crippled uncle." Nalinah stood her ground. The child peeked from behind her legs. "You leave," she said. "This place is ours now." Pike sneered. "If you protect him, you become him. You think you're different? Think being big makes you bulletproof? I'll bury you right here and blame it on the weather." Clive's chains shifted, a small metallic sound, but still he didn't speak. Pike leaned in close to the bars. "I ought to shoot you now. Save the state the trouble." Clive finally looked at him. Not angry, not afraid, just steady. "You'd have done it already," he said. Pike stepped back, his smirk curdling. He spat in the snow, turned to his men, and barked, "Let's go." When they rode off, the air felt thinner. Clive sat unmoving, but Nalinah saw it. His hands resting in his lap trembled, just enough to betray him, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe the cage wasn't holding a monster. Maybe it was holding a man who didn't know how to be free. The wind had turned warmer, just enough to melt the top layer of snow and slick the stones beneath with icy sheen. Patches of earth showed through, dark and wet, like the mountain itself was bleeding. Nalinah sat by the fire with a needle and thread, mending the child's coat. Clive was quiet that day, his usual mutterings absent, his eyes fixed not on her, but somewhere far behind her, past the trees, into a past no fire could warm. The child, wrapped in fresh pelts, slept soundly for the first time in days. Her breath was steady, her cheeks rosy, her tiny hands curled like flower buds against her chest. Nalinah watched her a while, brushing the hair from her forehead, then looked across the flames. You haven't eaten. Clive didn't answer. She stared. You haven't spoken since they left. I'm thinking, he said, his voice low. About what? Clive shifted his weight. The chains rattled. He looked down at his wrists. The cuffs rusted into his skin like they'd grown there. Then he lifted his head. You ever seen a man burn alive? Nalinah didn't speak. I have. He exhaled, slow. He screamed like an animal. Not because he was guilty. He wasn't. His name was James Kitterly. Had a wife, 2 boys. He refused to sell his land to the railroad. Clive leaned his head back against the iron bars. His voice was steady, not theatrical, not looking for pity, just laying stones down, one by one. The company needed a stretch of land, flat, perfect for the line. Trouble was, it cut straight through the valley where half a dozen families lived. Poor folks, dirt farmers. But that dirt meant something to them, generations deep. So they said no. He closed his eyes. They sent men to make them say yes. Men with no names. Hired fists. They didn't ask twice. The fire popped between them. My daughter, Elsabeth, was 10. She saw them torch the Kitterly house. Ran back to tell her mother. I wasn't home. I was helping another settler fence off his property. By the time I got back, his voice cracked but held. She was inside the barn, hiding. Nalinah's breath caught. The barn went up next. No one knew she was there, not even the men who lit it. Or maybe they did. Maybe they didn't care. He fell silent. My wife, she couldn't carry that. She walked into the river 2 nights later, pockets full of stone. Nalinah reached for the thread in her hands, but her fingers had gone still. I tried to bring it to court. Sheriff refused to file it, said it was a railroad matter. I wrote letters, no answer. So I took names, and I took lives. He looked up. The firelight flickered across the hollows of his face. I hunted them, one by one. Every man who touched that land, who signed that deal, who rode with the torchbearers. I didn't use a gun unless I had to. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted them to know what they took. And when I was done, he said, there wasn't anything left but smoke and guilt. So I came up here. I built this cage with my own hands, from scrap, from shame, welded it into the stone with the fire that should have killed me too. I locked myself in and swore I wouldn't leave unless someone with a clean heart said I should. Nalinah stared at him, the tears sliding soundlessly down her face, not out of sympathy, not sorrow, recognition. Because she knew what it meant to be cast out for doing what was right, to carry the cost of someone else's silence. She reached across the fire, laid a piece of cornbread on the flat rock just inside his reach, and whispered, you should have let it kill you, but you didn't. Clive didn't move. His eyes were glassy. I don't know if that makes me lucky or cursed. It makes you unfinished, she said. And for the first time, he looked at her not as a warden, not as a threat, but as someone who might see the man behind the iron. The fire burned low, but neither of them moved to feed it. It didn't need tending, not tonight. Dryvale was a town balanced on the edge of fear. Its buildings, slouched wooden frames with rusted hinges and signs that creaked in the wind, seemed to lean closer together that week, as if trying to eavesdrop on their own gossip. Smoke from 100 hearths carried rumors faster than words, curling under doors and through windows, winding around porch rails like restless spirits. And at the center of it all stood Sheriff Orland Pike. He was a man carved from suspicion, stiff-backed and silver-eyed, with a voice like a knife sliding from a sheath. He'd once worn a Pinkerton badge, and though those days were long behind him, the pride had never left his posture. It was in the way he walked into the saloon without nodding, the way his boots found the center of every room, the way he didn't ask for attention. He simply expected it. They're hiding him, he growled from the pulpit of the town hall, his gloved hands slamming down on the table. Clive Tamerlane, the Ridge Reaper. I seen him with my own eyes, breathing, alive, up there in the mountain with that savage woman and a stolen child. A murmur spread through the crowd of townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder, faces drawn tight with unease. Some remembered the old stories, the disappearances, the smoke rising from the ridge, the men who went hunting and never came home. Others didn't know the name Clive Tamerlane, but they didn't need to. Pike gave them a new one, Monster. Do you want your children sleeping while that killer looks down from the trees? Huh? Do you want your women walking the woods with that brute lurking, waiting? From the back of the room, a voice called out, steady, firm. That woman saved a child's life. Heads turned as Tilda Crane stepped forward, her long gray braids swaying over her shawl. She was Dryvale's midwife, healer, and the only white woman still welcome in the tribal borderlands. Her face was weathered by wind and wisdom, and her eyes, though tired, held no fear. Nalinah was cast out for protecting an innocent, Tilda said. She carries more heart than half the men here put together, and if she's with that man, maybe you ought to ask why. Pike's jaw twitched. You defending him? I'm defending her, Tilda said. And maybe, just maybe, you should stop lighting matches under a powder keg you don't understand? But Pike wasn't listening. He'd already begun recruiting. By morning, 3 men stood guard at the North Pass, rifles in hand. A 4th rode to the telegraph office to send word to the railroad. Possible fugitive spotted, danger to progress, request marshals immediately. Dryvale turned quiet, too quiet. Shopkeepers watched the trees more than their tills. Children were kept indoors. Even the preacher shortened his sermons. But Tilda didn't rest. She saddled her mule, packed a tin of salve, 3 clean blankets in a jar of boiled sweet root, then rode hard into the hills. Snow melted beneath her hooves. She knew the path. Steep, narrow, dangerous in thaw, but her hands didn't tremble. She found Nalinah at dusk, skin streaked with soot from cooking fires. Eyes already narrowed before Tilda even dismounted. They're coming, Tilda said, voice calm. Nalinah didn't blink. For him. For you, too. She handed Nalinah the bundle and stepped back. Railroad won't stop at the cage. They'll burn the whole ridge if they think it's in the way. Nalinah looked toward the cage where Clive sat staring into the trees, as if he already knew. Tilda's voice softened. You still got time to run. Take the girl. Head north. Find the border towns. I know a family. No, Nalinah said. We don't run. Tilda gave a slow nod. There was no fear in the girl's face, only a deep, steady knowing. The kind of strength not born, but forged. She left them in the dark, firelight flickering against the iron bars. Behind her, the mountain stood quiet, but it would not stay that way for long. The cage groaned in the night wind, its rusted bars creaking like old bones remembering storms. Snow had started to fall again, soft and slow, dusting the camp in silence. The trees above shifted like watchful elders, their limbs heavy with cold. In the firelight, the cage didn't look like punishment anymore. It looked like a grave that forgot how to close. Nalinah sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the man inside. Clive had grown thinner. His shoulders, once broad enough to block wind, now sloped like tired stone. His coat hung loose. He coughed often, and when he did, he turned away, hiding it in the crook of his arm. But she'd seen the blood in the snow, a flash of red against white, truth against denial. The child slept beside her, wrapped in furs. Her breath puffed in quiet rhythm. She had no idea that the mountain around her was holding its breath. Nalinah stared at the iron, the lock, the chains, the man. What good does it do? She asked aloud, not sure if she was speaking to him or the wind. Sitting there, wasting. Clive didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was familiar now. She rose and walked to the bars, gripping one with both hands. Cold bit her skin, but she didn't flinch. Tell me, is this justice or is it fear? Are you afraid that if the cage opens, what's inside you comes out again? Clive looked up, slow and hollow-eyed. His voice was a whisper dragged through gravel. You think I haven't asked myself that every day? Then why stay? She pressed. You've helped me. You've protected her. You've taught me to survive. And you never asked for anything back. Clive coughed again. This time he didn't turn. The blood glistened on his fingers in the firelight. I'm not done paying, he said. I made a vow, and I don't break what I swear. To who? She snapped. To God? To the ghosts of the men you killed? Or to your daughter, who's already gone? His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. She stepped closer. I don't want to watch another good man die behind iron. Clive's eyes flicked to hers. There was no anger there, just sorrow. You're still angry, he said gently, still fighting the world. If you free me now, it'll be because you want to hurt someone else. Not because you believe I deserve it. You think this is about them? She hissed. No, this is about me. About the girl who watched her mother bleed and never got justice. About the woman who was exiled for saving a life. About all of us who live in cages we didn't build. Her voice cracked. Don't you dare pretend you're the only one with something to atone for. Clive's face crumpled then, not from anger, but pain. I know, he said. That's why I can't ask you. She reached into her coat, pulled out the iron key and held it up between them. It swung on a leather cord, catching the light. I've had this since the second day, she said. You dropped it when you were carving names into the pine. He closed his eyes. You never locked yourself in, she said. You only pretended to. I locked my soul in, he whispered. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached through the bars, her hand trembling, and kissed him, not on the mouth, on the forehead, gentle as a blessing. Her lips were warm from the fire, his skin cold as stone. It wasn't lust. It wasn't pity. It was forgiveness made flesh. Clive exhaled, one long breath that shook his whole body. And then he wept. Not like a man ashamed, but like one remembering how to be human. The train whistled once as it pulled into Dryvale, its iron wheels grinding against the earth like teeth. The station master barely had time to set his pipe down before the doors clanged open and men began spilling onto the platform, sharp-dressed, sharp-eyed, and silent. They wore wool suits lined with leather and carried rifles strapped to their backs beside satchels stuffed with papers and ink-stamped seals. These were not settlers. These were not lawmen. These were the hands of industry, and they came with the smell of soot and blood beneath their cologne. At their center walked Graham Wick, tall, narrow as a sword, and dressed in a coat too fine for the dust of Dryvale. Wick's smile never touched his eyes. His boots gleamed. His gloves were bone white, and he carried a rolled parchment like a priest carrying scripture. Only this scripture came with maps, coordinates, and pre-approved signatures. Land grants, rail lines, claim deeds. He stepped onto the wooden platform like it was a stage. Sheriff Pike, he said with mock warmth, extending a gloved hand. Pike didn't smile. Took your time. I came fast as progress would allow, Wick replied, eyes already scanning the gathered crowd like a butcher appraising cattle. Where is he? Still up there, Pike muttered. In a cage, if the stories are true, with that Apache brute and the girl. Wick's smile widened. How quaint. He snapped his fingers. One of his men stepped forward and unfurled a yellowed wanted poster. Clive Tamerlane, wanted, dead or alive. The ink had faded, but the numbers hadn't. $1,000 for the corpse, 2 for the capture, Seems the state forgot to scratch this one off the ledger, Wick said. Good for us. Bad for them. Pike took the poster, studied it. You're not here for the bounty. Wick's eyes gleamed. I'm here for the land, and to cleanse it of whatever still haunts it. The saloon shutters creaked in the wind. The townsfolk watching from porches and windows said nothing. Some turned away. Others just stared. Tilda Crane stood at the far end of the boardwalk, arms crossed, lips tight. We'll burn them out, Pike said. If he's half the killer they say he is, fire'll make him crawl. Wick nodded. And if it doesn't, then bullets will. That night Tilda called a meeting at the chapel. Only a few came. The preacher, the stable boy, the widow Maggs, whose son Clive had once pulled from a stampede. She told them what Pike and Wick planned. Burn the ridge, flatten the trees, build a depot where wild things used to grow. Clive may be many things, Tilda said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. But he's no danger to this town. And that girl, she's a child of mercy. She saved a life, and they exiled her for it. Maybe she's hiding a killer, one man muttered. Or maybe, Tilda snapped, she's healing one. Silence followed. Most left with their heads down. A few looked over their shoulders as though afraid the trees themselves might be listening. Fear ruled their hearts, just like it always had. The fear of what they didn't understand, of justice that didn't wear a badge. By morning, the smoke from the railmen's torches could be seen curling into the sky, and up on the ridge, Nalinah stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the black tendrils rise. She did not blink. She did not turn away. Beside her, the child clutched her hand, and behind them, the cage creaked softly in the wind, as if bracing itself for what was to come. The sky turned the color of old bruises as the first trees caught fire. At first, it was just the smell, wood smoke drifting through the wind like a warning. Then came the crackle, low and steady, as flames climbed bark and whispered to branches. The ridge, once quiet and white with snow, now bled black at the edges. Smoke crawled up through the underbrush, choking the air and painting the sky in ash. Sparks danced on the wind like angry spirits, flitting across pine needles and dry moss. Nalinah stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes sharp, jaw set. The child stood behind her, small hand clutching the hem of her coat. She could hear men shouting in the distance, railroad agents moving through the forest, torches in hand, guns slung low. They weren't here to talk. They were here to erase. She turned and began moving fast. She packed the child's satchel with food, slung water over her shoulder, tucked a flint knife in her boot. Then she set down the rifle, Clive's rifle, the one he'd handed her 2 days ago without a word, just a look that said, "You'll know when to use it." Smoke thickened. The child coughed. Clive's voice came from the cage, hoarse. "Take her and go." "I'm not leaving," Nalinah said, not slowing. "You've done enough." She turned to face him. "Not yet." His face was streaked with soot. His eyes narrowed from the smoke. He looked smaller than he had weeks ago. Thinner, worn. But his presence still filled the space between those bars like thunder behind glass. "They'll shoot you before you get 10 paces, he said. "You're standing in the path of men who don't care who they burn." "I've seen men like that before," she said. "They burned my mother's herbs. They burned my name. I survived." Clive's hands gripped the bars. "You'll die trying to save a ghost." Nalinah stepped forward, her boots crunching frost and ash. She reached into her coat, pulled the key from around her neck, and held it out in front of her. "Then you ain't a ghost no more." Clive's breath hitched. The fire popped behind her. Sparks lit her hair like a crown of embers. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she stepped forward and fit the key into the lock. The bolt slid back with a sound that cracked the air like a gunshot. It echoed through the trees, past the sleeping deer and the scared birds, through the smoke and down into the hearts of the men still climbing the ridge. Clive didn't move. He stared at the open door like it was something sacred or cursed. Nalinah stepped back, the key still in her hand. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The wind carried the roar of fire closer. Flames began licking the low brush on the eastern slope. The air grew hotter. A pine branch burst behind them, sending a spray of embers across the clearing. Clive remained still inside the cage, eyes fixed on the threshold. The door hung open. His chains lay slack. But he did not step out. Not yet. The wind screamed through the trees like a wounded animal, carrying with it the roar of flame and the shouted orders of men who'd never seen war, only power. Smoke wrapped the ridge in a choking shroud, curling around limbs and blinding eyes. The fire had split in two, climbing fast on either side of the trail. Pines exploded from within as their sap turned to steam. Somewhere below, a man cursed and fell through the brush. And then, Clive stepped from the cage. He didn't burst out. He didn't roar. He simply placed one hand on the edge of the iron door, pushed it open, and crossed the threshold like a man walking into his own funeral with dignity in his spine. The leather coat lay folded in the shelter where Nalinah had kept it dry, knowing somehow he might need it again. He took it without a word, slipped his arms through the sleeves, then pulled the old Winchester from the hooks above the camp's lean-to. Nalinah watched him. She didn't ask where he'd go. She knew. The rifle still bore the scratch marks from a cougar attack 12 winters ago, and the stock had a crack running through it like a fault line. But in Clive's hands it looked whole again, as if it had never been meant to rest. He turned to Nalinah, eyes clear. "Where's the girl?" "She's with Tilda. They went to fetch water before the fire jumped the trail." Clive nodded once. "Then we get them first." Together they moved. The trail was half gone, collapsed beneath scorched roots and falling limbs. Nalinah moved ahead, cutting through bramble with her knife. Clive followed close, marking the flanks, his rifle never lowered. Smoke stung their eyes, but they pressed on. Halfway down the slope, they heard it, a panicked scream, a splash, then silence. They found Tilda hanging from a ledge, one hand clutching a root, the other holding the girl against her chest. The trail beneath her feet had crumbled, giving way to a drop that ended in jagged rock. Clive didn't hesitate. He set the rifle down, slid belly first onto the dirt, and reached. His arms were longer than they looked, stronger even after the months of rot and rust. He caught Tilda's wrist, pulled until his shoulder screamed, and then Nalinah grabbed his belt from behind, anchoring them both. Together they hauled Tilda and the child to safety. Once upright, Tilda collapsed into Nalinah's arms, coughing, weeping. "They set the West Grove on fire," she said. "They're herding you in." Clive's jaw clenched. "Then we'll herd them back." They set traps along the ridgeline, tripwires strung between saplings, snares hidden beneath leaves, rocks loosened above narrow switchbacks. Nalinah took the east, Clive took the west. Their movements mirrored each other like old soldiers. The first man they caught was a young one, eager, soft-palmed. He screamed when the snare cinched his ankle and sent him dangling upside down into a hornet's nest. The second ran at Clive with a torch. Clive shot the torch clean out of his hand. The third slipped on pine pitch and slid headfirst into the creek bed, breaking his arm on a stone. Word began to spread among the men, something cold and sharp and crawling up their backs. The Ridge Reaper walks again. But this time, he didn't kill for revenge. He struck with precision, spared the wounded, warned before firing. The fire still raged around them, but in the spaces between flame and fear, something stronger was being built. Something older than justice. Clive Tamerlane was not there to burn the world. He was there to protect it. The fire had slowed but not died. Smoke still drifted like ghosts through the blackened branches, and the air was thick with the copper scent of scorched earth and gunpowder. The heart of the ridge, the open clearing just beyond the shelter, stood half-burned and silent, lit only by the last embers of flame and the glow of dawn breaking behind the distant peaks. Clive stood at the center of it all, blood soaking through the side of his coat. He gripped the rifle in one hand, his other pressed to the wound just beneath his ribs. The shot had torn through flesh but missed bone. Still it burned. He didn't stagger. He didn't speak. He simply breathed slow and waited. Across the clearing, Sheriff Pike raised his pistol again. "You should have stayed in that cage," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You should have rotted like the animal you are." Clive raised his rifle. "You first, Orlin." The crack of gunfire shattered the stillness. Clive's shot went wide, the pain pulling his aim. Pike's bullet found its mark, just beneath Clive's left collarbone. He dropped to one knee but didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, spit blood into the dirt, and rose again. But before Pike could fire again, a shadow slammed into him from the side. Nalinah. She hit him like a tree falling, full force, knocking his gun loose and sending both of them crashing into the ash and dirt. He clawed at her, snarling, but she was faster. Her elbow cracked against his jaw, and his head snapped back. Before she could strike again, another voice cut through the smoke. "Behind you!" Graham Wick emerged from the trees, a revolver in each hand, coat trailing smoke, face red with fury. He fired twice, the bullets grazing bark and dust as Nalinah rolled clear. She rose, eyes locked on him. "Savage girl," he hissed. "You think this land matters? You think you can stop progress?" She didn't answer. She ran, straight at him. They collided at the edge of the ridge trail, fists in fury, rolling through soot and root and rock. Wick reached for his blade. Too slow. Nalinah struck him in the throat, then shoved him backward with both hands. He fell. Not far, not to his death, but down into the ravine, vanishing with a thud and a cry. Alive, but broken. Silence followed. Then footsteps. From the southern trail came the townsfolk, men and women of Dryvale, rifles slung, faces grim. At their head was Tilda Crane, her shawl pulled tight, her jaw set like stone. She looked to Clive, bloodied and still standing. Then to Nalinah, ash-streaked and breathing hard. And then to Pike, who was crawling toward his pistol. "Don't," she said coldly. The townsfolk raised their rifles. Pike froze. Tilda stepped forward, took a deep breath, and said what none of them expected. "We were wrong." The wind caught the words and carried them. "We let fear tell us who to hate. We let lies shape our justice. But no more." One by one, the townsfolk nodded, not in shame, but in resolve. Clive slumped against a rock. Nalinah rushed to him, pressing her hand to his wound, her touch gentle but firm. "You'll live," she said, more prayer than fact. He looked up at her, eyes wet, and nodded. The land still smoldered. The trees still whispered, but the battle was over. Wick was dragged from the ravine in chains. Pike was disarmed and bound. And for the first time, the ridge was quiet, not with fear, not with fire, but with peace. 3 weeks passed and the ridge slowly exhaled. The snow returned in patches, blanketing the scorched earth like a promise. Birds came back first, tentative and few. Then rabbits nosing through the blackened underbrush. And then the people, quiet, unsure, but present. The mountain had seen war and mercy, fire and grace. Now it waited to see what the world would do next. On a gray morning, a black carriage rolled into Dryvale. The horses were Eastern bred, sleek and groomed. The driver wore a bowler hat and didn't speak. Inside the carriage sat a man with silver hair and spectacles perched on a nose sharp enough to cut paper. Judge Everett Langston, appointed by federal order. bearer of legal word and bureaucratic weight. He stepped down with practiced care, nodded once to Sheriff Pike's replacement, and requested one thing: take me to the cage. The journey up the ridge took hours, but the townsfolk cleared the path. Children held branches aside. Men hammered down the trail's edges. They didn't do it out of duty. They did it because something in them had shifted. They no longer feared the mountain. When the judge reached the clearing, the cage still stood, its door hanging open, its iron face scarred by weather and time. Clive stood beside it, hands folded, coat patched from the bullet holes but still worn like armor. Nalinah stood behind him, the child at her side, cheeks rosy and chin lifted high. The judge inspected the cage. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he turned to the gathering of townsfolk, half the valley it seemed, and nodded. I will hear testimony now. Tilda Crane stepped forward first. Her voice was clear, her words deliberate. She spoke of exile and mercy, of fire and betrayal, of the kind of justice that cannot be measured in jail time. Others followed: storekeepers, ranch hands, the preacher, even the schoolmistress. Each one gave a piece of the story, like stitching fabric over a wound. Finally, the judge looked to Clive. Do you deny the killings? Clive shook his head. I did what they say. Every one of them. Why? Clive's voice didn't shake. Because they set fire to my home, killed my daughter, and buried the law beneath coin. I hunted them not as a man of vengeance, but as a man who'd been forgotten by justice. And you built this cage? Yes. Of your own will? Clive nodded. I was waiting for someone with a clean heart to see me as more than a monster. The judge adjusted his glasses. Did they? He looked at Nalinah. She did, Clive said. Then unexpectedly, the child stepped forward. Elsie, small, sure, eyes bright with something older than her years. He helped save me, she said. He didn't have to, but he did. The judge looked at her a long time. Then he turned, hands behind his back, and walked around the cage one more time. No living legal witnesses remain, he said at last. No family to claim damages. The bounty is outdated. The railroad has withdrawn its petition in the wake of public outcry. And the testimony I've heard today. He paused as if searching for the right weight. Justice, he said, was not delayed. It was delivered. On this mountain. In this fire. In the choosing to stay locked when no one held the key. He turned to Clive. You are free. Clive blinked but said nothing. Nalinah reached for his hand. He took it. The judge tipped his hat. Tear down the cage or leave it. Either way, let it stand in memory, not judgment. And with that, he returned to his carriage and left Dryvale behind. The cage remained empty, open, untouched, a monument, not to punishment, but to the long road toward redemption. The snow melted slow that year, like it was reluctant to leave behind the memory of fire. Water ran in ribbons down the rocks, feeding the creeks, soaking deep into the mountain's wounded skin. Ash turned to soil, charred stumps softened, and from between their blackened roots, new green dared to rise. Clive stood at the edge of the clearing where his cabin had once been, sleeves rolled, hat low against the sun. The foundation stones were still there, half sunk and moss-covered, but sturdy. He ran his hand along the highest one, like a man greeting an old friend returned from war. This is where it starts, he said. Nalinah nodded and dropped a bundle of rope at his feet. The child ran barefoot through the clearing behind them, chasing a red-tailed butterfly with the kind of wild laughter that makes trees feel younger. They worked slow and steady, plank by plank. Clive chopped timber while Nalinah hauled and braced. The child learned to strip bark and sand edges, her small hands growing strong with each day. The first wall went up under a sky the color of forgiveness. The second came with the help of townsfolk. They arrived in ones and twos, quiet, unsure, but willing. Some brought nails, others brought beams. A few just brought hands and the humility of hearts that had once judged and now longed to repair. The preacher came with a wheelbarrow full of tools. The stable boy brought a carved wooden beam he'd made himself. Tilda brought her recipes and her stubborn, unshakable belief in healing. No one mentioned the cage. It stood nearby, half covered in wild vines now, the door still open. No one touched it, but no one tore it down either. It was no longer a prison, it was a memory. By the end of the third week, the cabin stood proud beneath the ridge, stronger, wider, warmer than the one Clive had built alone years ago. A second room for the child, a porch that caught the morning light, windows that faced east toward the rising sun. They planted a garden just behind the cabin. Nalinah showed the girl how to work the soil, how to speak to it softly like it was something sacred. Clive taught her to fish in the stream, how to tie a line and spot the shadow of a trout beneath still water. They didn't speak of past wounds, but they tended them just the same, with every carrot seed, every cast line, every shared silence. One evening, Clive sat on the porch sharpening a blade while the child drew in the dirt beside him. She sketched the cabin, the ridge, a woman with a braid, and a man with a long coat. She added a sun over them, big and bright, then stopped and looked up. "Do we live here now?" she asked. Clive looked out over the land, the garden, the porch, and the fire smoke rising slow into a clear sky. "Yes," he said, "we do. No more running, no more hiding, no more cages, only open sky, and the kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from choosing to begin again." Spring came early, like a gift the mountain had held back until it knew the people were ready. The last frost melted fast, running down the ridge in silver streams, and green broke through the blackened earth like a promise kept. Shoots curled out from the ashen ground where fire once ruled. Trees that had stood bare now shimmered with buds the color of hope. Birds returned, not in flocks, but in pairs, calling gently from branch to branch, like they, too, were remembering how to sing. Clive stood in a clearing by the old barn, where once he'd buried the heart of his sorrow. The fire had taken it years ago, the wood and the hay, and the girl hiding inside. For so long he hadn't returned to this patch of earth, but now he knelt in it, palms covered in dirt, planting seeds with quiet hands and a bowed head. He did not weep. He pressed beans deep into the soil, one by one, steady as breath. He watered them without ceremony. The sun warmed his shoulders and the breeze stirred the collar of his shirt. There was no need to speak her name. This, he knew, was the truest prayer he could give. Behind him, Nalinah walked the ridge path barefoot, singing. The melody was old, drawn from the memory of women who had carried stories through songs. She sang not for grief, but for the living, for the trees growing out of char, for the soil that held both bone and blossom. Her voice lifted into the wind and danced there, low and strong, like it had always belonged to the mountain. Sometimes when she sang near the garden, the child would stop what she was doing, sit cross-legged in the dirt, and listen with her head tilted like the birds. The child had taken to drawing with charcoal, thin, black lines on birch bark, on cabin walls, on river stones. She didn't speak much about what had happened, but she drew it all. Her fingers moved fast, smudging shadows into shape, capturing moments like they were smoke she didn't want to lose. One morning she handed Clive a piece of bark, her cheeks streaked with ash and joy. On it, a picture, rough, honest, and alive. A tall woman with long braids stood on one side, her arms open wide. A man, lean and weathered, stood opposite, rifle on his back, coat open to the wind. Between them was a child, and behind them, flames rose. But they didn't burn. They curled around the trio like wings or roots, or something holy that had tried to consume them but failed. Clive stared at it for a long time. "She drew that yesterday," Nalinah said softly. "Said it's us." He nodded. His voice was thick when he spoke. "She's not wrong." They hung the drawing inside the cabin, just above the hearth, not to forget the fire, but to remember how they stepped through it and did not turn to ash. The mountain, once silent with grief, breathed again. You could hear it in the wind through the trees, in the rustle of new leaves, in the creak of the porch as the child laughed and ran and lived. It didn't forget, but it forgave. So did they. The letter came on a Tuesday, sealed in wax and smelling faintly of lavender. Nalinah found it wedged beneath the cabin door, carried by a boy from town who'd ridden the trail on a borrowed mule. He'd left it without a word, too shy to knock, too awed by the stories the town had started to believe in. Clive opened the envelope with careful hands, the paper thick and fine, the handwriting looped in the elegant scrawl of a woman who wrote not often, but meaningfully. He read it twice, then passed it to Nalinah without a word. "My name is Ruthin Carter. Years ago, in the Elk Valley Pass, my husband was pinned beneath a fallen wagon. He would have died, crushed or frozen, if not for a stranger who lifted the wheel from his chest and carried him a mile through snow to the nearest town. He never knew your name, only remembered the gray in your beard and the scar on your hand. I read about you in the Gazette. I just wanted you to know. He lived another 10 years, long enough to raise our sons, long enough to thank God for mercy." Clive folded the letter slowly, his eyes distant, like the past had reached across time just to lay a hand on his shoulder. Word had begun to spread the week after the judge's ruling. A traveling reporter from the county seat rode into Dryvale with an ear for stories and a hunger for the unusual. Tilda sat him down with a pot of coffee and gave him more than he bargained for. She told him about the fire, the cage, the girl, and the two souls who refused to let the world define them. The article was printed in black and white columns under the headline, "The Reaper Who Repented." It ran in 3 states and drew letters from strangers, some angry but most curious, some even kind. Then came the donations. A banker's widow from back east sent $20 for the child's schooling. A Cherokee seamstress in New Mexico sent handmade shoes. A former lawman sent a Bible with a note tucked inside. Forgiveness matters more than the badge. Nalinah didn't trust the attention. She never had. But she saw what it did to Clive, how his shoulders lightened, how he stood taller when reading a line that proved he'd once done something right. Not all the world wanted him gone. The preacher came in early summer. He brought bread, honey, and a question he asked without ceremony. "I reckon it's time," he said. "You want me to marry you?" Nalinah looked at Clive. Clive looked at her. She smiled, quiet and full of knowing. "We're already bound. Not by law," Clive added, "by love and blood and fire." The preacher nodded once. "That's enough for any church I know." They ate the bread on the porch that evening. The child curled between them, dozing in the dusk light. No vows were spoken, no rings exchanged. Just silence and the sound of birdsong returning to the trees. Some legacies are written in ink. Others are carved into the soil, stitched into the hearts of those who choose to stay when they could have run. And on that ridge, with no one watching but the sky, a family planted itself deep. The summer night was thick with the scent of pine and soil turned warm by a long day sun. Crickets chirped in rhythm, and the wind carried the faint whistle of an owl echoing down the ridge. Inside the cabin, the child slept curled against the Nalinah's side while Clive sat at the hearth, sharpening his old blade. He wasn't expecting anything, but old instincts never truly slept. Down in the trees, a shadow moved. Sheriff Pike had escaped custody 3 nights prior. slipped the chains, stabbed a guard, and vanished into the dark. The marshals hadn't warned Dryvale yet, but Dryvale didn't need warning. It had learned to listen, learned to watch. He came not as a lawman this time, but as a ghost, his eyes sunken, beard wild, clothes torn from his flight. In his hand was a torch, freshly lit, and in his heart burned something twisted and ancient. Vengeance. He reached the ridge's edge and stared at the rebuilt cabin. It glowed warm, alive, filled with the one thing he could not forgive: peace. Pike hated peace, especially when it lived in the hearts of people he once ruled with fear. He raised the torch, ready to throw it, when a click stopped him. Tilda Crane stepped from the trees, rifle in hand, eyes hard as iron. Behind her came three others, townsfolk, silent, steady, unafraid. One held a rope, another a lantern. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They just closed in like the truth itself, patient and unstoppable. "You picked the wrong mountain," Tilda said coldly. Pike sneered, then lunged. But he didn't make it far. Clive's voice rang out from the cabin porch. "Drop it." Pike froze. Clive stood with his rifle resting on his shoulder, calm and unwavering. Nalinah flanked him, bow in hand. The child stayed inside, safe. Pike laughed, but it came out broken. "What now? You gonna kill me, Reaper? Finally give me the death you've been denying?" Clive didn't move. "No." Tilda nodded. "We're done killing." The townsfolk tied Pike's hands and led him to the square at dawn. No gallows, no hangman. Just a circle of people, old, young, scarred, and healing. A makeshift trial was held. Testimony given. No lies could breathe in the air that crisp. Pike was found guilty, not just of escape or attempted arson, but of what he'd always been guilty of: poisoning a town with fear. The sentence? Exile. He was given food, a canteen, and a mule, told to ride east and never return. The judge, still in town to oversee railroad matters, watched with silent approval. As Pike was led away, he turned to Clive and spat, "Weak, all of you. Weak." Clive stepped forward, eyes steady. "Mercy," he said, "ain't weakness. It's what saved me." The townsfolk stood behind him, not in fear but in unity. They'd watched a man build his own prison and choose to stay inside it until he was worthy of release. They'd seen rage turned into grace, iron softened by time and truth. The mountain watched too. No blood spilled that day, no fires burned. The ridge remained untouched, because justice, real justice, had finally come home. And this time, it healed. The wind was soft that morning, brushing gently through the high grass and whistling low between the pines. The ridge had changed in the years since the fire, but not entirely. Some trees bore burned scars, dark veins running through bark now thick with age. New life had grown around them. Stubborn flowers, young saplings, a tangle of berry vines that climbed where fences once stood. She stood at the edge of the trail, her long coat fluttering in the breeze, a satchel slung over her shoulder. Around her, children's voices rose and fell, laughing, gasping, murmuring in awe as they took in the view. The ridge spread wide and open before them, the land stretching toward the horizon like the spine of an old sleeping beast. "Is it true?" one girl asked, tugging at the hem of her shirt. "He lived in a cage?" The woman smiled, eyes dark and thoughtful. "He built it himself." "Why?" another boy asked, peering through the trees. "Was he dangerous?" She turned and faced them, her hand resting on the old cedar stump near the path. Her voice was gentle but steady. "He was broken," she said. "He did something terrible once, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't see another way. And afterward, he couldn't live with what he'd done. So he came here, and he stayed in that cage until the mountain forgave him. until he forgave himself. The children quieted. One of the older girls glanced at the cage in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Rusted now, leaning to one side, its iron door forever open. The trail to it was narrow but clear, lined with smooth stones and footprints long faded by rain. The woman led them closer. "The story ain't about the cage," she said as they walked. "It's about what comes after." They reached the clearing, and the children fanned out. No one touched the cage. They circled it the way one might circle a sacred site, respectful, hushed. Birds chirped in the canopy above. A squirrel darted along a branch and paused to watch. The woman stepped inside the cage. No chains, no ghosts, only earth, soft beneath her boots. She pulled a bundle of wildflowers from her satchel, sunbright petals, white daisies, red sprigs from the river's edge, and laid them gently in the center. She bowed her head, just for a moment, and whispered something the children could not hear. Then thunder rumbled across the sky, not violent or cruel, but low and rolling, like a drumbeat calling the earth to attention. The woman lifted her head. She looked out across the ridge. In the distance, the cabin stood strong, smoke curling from its chimney. The garden was still there. So was the porch. She turned to the children. "He taught me the ridge ain't just a place. It's a choice to stay, to fight, to heal." The children nodded. Some took notes. Others just watched the sky. And when the wind shifted, carrying the thunder's song down into the trees, the mountain did not sound like mourning. It sounded like music. The kind you hear when cages are no longer needed. The kind you carry with you, long after the story ends.